New faces. In a slight change to the previously advertised agenda, the Minister for Digital and Broadband, Matt Warman, is actually unable to be here in person. Is democratic, well, he's subject to a three-line whip to not be here, basically. So this can happen, but we have got a short speech by him, which is sent over for us specifically for this afternoon, and I know he is extremely sorry to not be here in person and is very much engaged in these issues and indeed intending to be in the Berlin UN IGF meeting.
Though I can't join you in person, I would like to voice my strong support for the UK IGF. I firmly believe that the multi-stakeholder model of internet governance is the best way to ensure a free, open and secure internet, and the UK IGF plays an important role in promoting this approach. The government is committed to making the UK the safest place in the world to be online and the best place in the world to start and grow a digital business. Our challenge as a society is to help shape an internet that is open and vibrant but protects users from harm. I believe the UK is uniquely placed to spearhead the digital transformation of society. As we live through the fourth industrial revolution, digital ethics are a central part of our modern debate. We must recognise that effective ethical regulation and governance is necessary to achieve this goal. Regulation needs to be innovative, agile and forward-thinking to match the pace of technology. Earlier in the year, we published the Online Harms White Paper, which sets out our plans for world-leading legislation to make companies more responsible for their users' safety online, especially children and other vulnerable groups.
Okay. Hello. Nice. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here. The internet is very bad. This really does seem to be the message we are hearing from governments around the world, from the media, from experts. The internet is very bad. Demos, the think tank that I work for, commissioned new polling, and the public also thought the internet was very bad, that social media made fake news worse, that it made mental illness worse, that it isn't trustworthy. 4 in 10 young adults reported they are addicted to social media, whatever that means. The internet is very bad. Digital extremism is on the rise. The web is driving loneliness. Social media is destroying our attention spans. The internet is used to attack Western democracy by hostile states. It's a safe haven for criminals and trolls and cyberbullies and scammers and con artists, Katie Hopkins. It is centralizing power in the hands of a tiny elite. It excludes the vulnerable. It is used to hoard data and profile us, then all that data is hacked or leaked. Young people are being radicalized online, old people are being radicalized online, we're all being radicalized online. Facebook conspiracy theories have my dad ranting about chemtrails, porn is everywhere, the police can't do everything, the earth is flat, the internet is very bad. I am tired, I think, now of hearing just how bad everything is. Maybe everything isn't all bad, maybe there are positives, or maybe there are paths forward or lessons about what we should do differently. I hope for the next half hour we'll be able to have a go at exploring what good looks like. What are the principles that should underpin a healthy digital commons? What parts of the internet aren't bad and what can we learn from them? And how do we create an economic model that incentivizes it all? And it's vital that we do. We are in a race. There are competing visions of the internet emerging from Silicon Valley to Beijing to Moscow, and we, I think, are falling behind. We need more than complaining. We need a vision, a strategy, and a blueprint. Now, to explore this, I have a fantastic panel of experts. Darren Jones is MP for Bristol North West, Vice Chair of the APPG for Consumer Protection, and member of the APPG on AI, and Director of Labour Digital. Victoria Nash is Deputy Director, Associate Professor, and Senior Policy Fellow at the OII, the Oxford Internet Institute, and Chloe Colliver, who's Director of the Digital Analysis Unit at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. Now, I'm very keen to get questions and comments from the audience. I think we're going to do a combination of the sort of new one, which I'm told is called Slido. Are you familiar with this? Okay, more than me. But we'll also go around with questions at the end. And I think to kick things off, it would be great to, just for a couple of minutes, hear from each of our panelists sort of what does good look like here? Darren, maybe.
Well, good afternoon. both of those opening statements have made me slightly nervous. I think Matt not being here means I might have to vote, but I think we'll be all right for the time that I'm on the panel anyway. And I hadn't realised the internet was so bad, which worries me too. So I'm hoping we'll come to a conclusion where we think it's not all that bad. From my perspective as a legislator, we think about regulatory design and how we protect the interests of our constituents in our country, but also how we create a competitive industrial strategy, a competitive economy, and the way in which we can have an influence around the world. And I think all of these are linked up to this question of the digital society, but also the way in which we regulate the internet. I released a paper last week, I think it was, on the next recession. Sorry to be a doomsayer, but there will be one at some point. Hopefully we don't cause it ourselves by triggering a no-deal Brexit, but you never know. And in the environment in which we have an economic downturn, we can't really get the Bank of England to reduce base rates because they're already low, which means you have a fiscal stimulus obligation, which means the government investing and intervening in the market to drive demand. And the central thesis of my argument was that actually the digital transformation of our public services especially, but also helping the private sector become better on these issues needs to be central to the way in which government invests and incentivizes and works on an economy-wide mission around digital transformation. Now, for that to work, we've got to get the fundamentals right, both in terms of our own country, our relationship with the European Union. I don't want to sound like an elitist Remainer, but I still have some hope that we might still be a member of the European Union, but let's see. Let's not do a vote on the screen on that. But also the geopolitics of it, I think, is extremely important because, of course, we don't just think about what we do for our own country, but we think about the world in which we live in. And one of the concerns that I've had for a while is the lack of international collaboration at governmental level on these types of issues. We're seeing a very geopolitical change in the way that other countries, largely in the East, think that we ought to be regulating or using the internet compared to what we would loosely describe as Western liberal democratic values. And from a legislator's perspective, there's not really a great deal of collaboration on these topics taking place. And I think we need to be much better at doing that. But I do think that we can get it right, but that we've got to get on with it, which is why I was pleased to be invited today and to hear from you hopefully in the Q&A later today.
Where are we going to be with regards to international collaboration? Where do you think the UK sits at the moment?
I think we have, it depends. If we remain part of the European Union, then we need to be continuing to play a leading role reforming and remaining in the European Union. I know many of you will know, but the UK already plays a significant part in terms of European legislation, especially on these types of issues, where other member states recognise and value the expertise and contributions of the UK at every level of our engagement with the European Union. My preference is that we continue to do that. The EU has a bit of a reputation globally for being a kind of a regulatory exporter. And there's obviously, under Ursula von der Leyen, she's highlighted the importance of the digital economy and making Margrethe Vestager the Executive Vice President for the digital economy alongside her competition priorities. I think for us in the EU, there's a question about how we stimulate an economy that gets us the outputs versus how we regulate and what that impact has on the world. If we leave the European Union, it will weaken our ability to influence these issues, largely because of our relationship with trade and regulatory standards. And of course, there will be a big debate about whether we end up taking a more strategic approach to aligning with United States standards as part of a US trade deal, where of course they will be interested in digital economy and digital services, or whether we align with European standards, which tend to be higher. My preference is that we stay on the EU side, and as part of that, we can have a broader impact around the world too.
Thanks so much, Victoria.
So to go back to that first question of what does a healthy society look like? I did love your introduction because in a way it sort of summarises, I think, my last 18 years of work, or experience of the conversations I've had, certainly in the last 18 years of work. I guess, we were talking about this earlier, I feel really frustrated in a way that we're now at a point where digital technologies and the internet, they're not sort of separate from real life, they are just part of our everyday life, they are part of every activity that we find fulfilling, every activity that we find frustrating. And I think that for me, certainly if we're looking forward to 2050, one of the key things is to perhaps sort of step away from some of what I see to be slightly overheated sort of moral panic around digital, around tech, often very deterministic, and maybe just take a sort of slightly calmer view of what it does for us, and in particular, what a great ringtone. And in particular, of just how far, if you like, the benefits are an essential part of it, as well as potential negative aspects too. I also do have to disagree a little bit with what you said. So, for example, obviously you can look at, well, we all know from Brexit that polling data will tell you pretty much anything you want it to tell you, it seems sometimes. Our most recent survey, though, the Oxford Internet Survey, suggested that actually 79% of all people who use the internet would agree that technology is making things better, right? If you look at the figures on what people do with their internet, figures for commercial use, shopping, buying, banking, watching videos, listening to music, posting content, keeping in touch with your family, all these are going up, which suggests to me that people find these valuable and important. For me, one of the worrying signs, though, is that actually those figures, for example, around attitudes are much, much lower around people who don't use technology. So for me, this is one of the big challenges, is, if you like, sort of explaining and helping people see the benefits of digital technologies without them when they're not using it in the first place. So, for example, 29% of non-users agree that technology is making things better. Only a third, right? It's very dramatically different. I think, though, if we think about what a healthy digital society looks like, to me it's one where it's perfectly possible to flourish through your use and with your use of technology. So not just to be safe, not just to be secure, not just to have access to information, but to flourish. And to me that means, focusing much more heavily, I suppose, on all the ways in which technology contributes to the things that we find fundamentally important, and then ensuring the design of those technologies is such that it does help us keep safe and secure whilst doing those. I've got a lot more to say, but I'm going to stop there because I know we want questions.
When we think about the future in the internet, we sort of, it'd be great if we had some evidence for what good might look like in your work or in other work. Where should we be looking for this kind of evidence?
So I suppose it depends. There's some evidence that we definitely do have. There's some evidence that we can't get. So what does good look like? We have plenty of attitudinal data. We have plenty of use data in terms of things like surveys, what people do, interviews, surveys, focus groups, what people think about it. What actually we have relatively little information on, though, is, if you like, sort of causal patterns. So in other words, I might think, for example, that I don't know, spending lots of time following certain celebrities online is really enjoyable and satisfying. But actually, what does it do for my mood over the course of a day? What does it do to my eating habits? Those are questions that we find very difficult to answer because we still don't have access to the types of commercial data that we as social scientists would need in order to understand those phenomena. So we do understand a bit about what good looks like and what the risks look like, but we can't answer those questions fully without having better access to the data.
Chloe?
Well, coming from a background of studying terrorism, extremism, and disinformation on the internet, I would be tempted to agree, Alex, with your extremely pessimistic view of the world. But I have to say I can't. The internet has given us Grumpy Cat, RIP, Me Too, Colleen Rooney's investigative skills. I think getting to your bigger question here of how do we think about understanding what good might look like and how do we evidence that and how do we potentially try and implement that. If we step back and look at the worlds of physical engineering or the worlds of urban planning, these are similarly kind of complex, enormous systems with a huge range of variables and different control mechanisms within them that took many years to think about responsibility, to think about power, to think about structure, duties of care, whatever you might want to talk about. And I think where we've gone a little bit wrong in the conversation around digital is that we haven't maybe taken that same complex approach to thinking about the problems we see and the way we might want to fix them, instead focusing much too much on these smaller little issues of content and content moderation and not thinking broadly enough about the systems in which all of that sits. And I think coming from a conversation over the last 3 years, which has been going on for a very long time around terrorist use of the internet, extremist use of the internet, that really tried to focus very strongly on that issue of content. We've seen how that fails in producing a safe and healthy environment. That's not how you get at the problem. It doesn't get to the root of the problem. It doesn't get to the systems and the processes that enable that problem to exist. So, if we want to avoid running around whack-a-mole for the next 5 years trying to figure out how to deal with risk and harm online, I think we need to step back and look much more at the systemic level of this. And it might sound fluffy, but thinking about how we level the playing field for different voices online that's now become incredibly skewed. There are quite, I think, specific ways we can think about doing that. The ICO's report on ad tech recently obviously came out with a very strong statement around the kind of fraudulent and in some ways illegal systems that underpin a lot of the business structures of our modern day internet. That kind of outrage and attention economy is sat on very specific interests. And I think if we can start to try and grapple with those at a systemic level, we might get to some of the more systemic harms and risks that we're talking about here in your introduction. So I'd start with that and say that it's not just a question really for governments, it's not just a question of regulation, but the private sector, industry, brands, there's a whole realm of stakeholders, and I think the IGF is such an interesting forum to talk about this in because it is a multi-stakeholder collaboration, and that effort will need to be multi-part. So I'll leave it there for now because I know we want to leave it for questions.
Victoria mentioned transparency as something that seems hugely important in measuring and understanding really what's going on. Are questions around transparency questions that you face in the work that you do?
Absolutely. And in our consultation on the white paper, we wrote a lot about transparency in the different areas that might need to be developed in, specifically around advertising online, around content moderation processes and practices online, around processes for appeals and redress, so that users have an empowered vision of how they can access their own help online when they're put in a situation they don't agree with, but also transparency around algorithmic output, which is obviously one of the more complex areas to think about and is something that no one's really grappled with in full yet, but that there are interesting models from other sectors that we could look to think about white box testing and how a regulator might be able to do some of that experimental testing. So I think all of those areas of transparency are going to be crucial if researchers, if a regulator, if the public are really going to be able to understand their experience online, how much of that really is safe and healthy and how much of it really might be harmful to them as well.
Darren, is that a view you sort of shared, this focus on process improvement, the idea that we need to move beyond content? Is that something that you sort of reflected in Labour Digital and the work that you've done?
Yes, a lot of the debate in Parliament, which obviously has come out in the Online Harms White Paper, is around regulatory structure, as well as maybe individual questions around particular aspects of regulation. I mean, my observation on all of it, which we talked about through Labour Digital, although there is somewhat of a consensus between some of the suggestions in the Online Harm White Paper and some of the announcements that my colleague Tom Watson announced around maybe a reform or a new regulator to take on some of these issues. But if you look at existing regulated sectors, there's nothing really, I don't think, overtly new that we need to think about. So I was a lawyer. I worked in the energy and the telecommunications sector, so worked with Ofgem and Ofcom, both in private practice and in-house, before my election. And actually the principles of a sector regulator, duties of care, guidance, the ability for regulators to get access to information, to check that if harm is actually happening, how you then change that. That feels like that, but it works already, so we should maybe just be thinking about how do we expand that to work in these new areas. And an example for, I work in technology because I'm a bit of a geek on it, but not because my constituents ask me to on a street stall on a Saturday morning or because I knock on their door. The one thing that does come up though is online fraud. And I've had some horrible cases of constituents who have lost significant sums of money because of online fraud. And so there's an obligation on us not just to think about the kind of civil circumstances in which we put regulators on industry, but actually ask ourselves, as the provider of public services, are our enforcement and police services, for example, funded and equipped well enough to be able to tackle the criminal activity that happens in these spaces too? And quite frankly, we're not. So we do need to think about both sides of the coin. But ultimately, my constituents largely just want to know that there's someone that's got their back in the kind of traditional way, and that if there is an argument, in the same way in the energy sector, if your bill's gone crazy or in your broadband provider's done something wrong, you can either individually go through an ombudsman process or take a complaint to a regulator, or which or others can bring class actions on behalf of consumers. Those are the types of things that should exist better. And actually, the ICO is being asked to do so much with so little resource that if an individual in my constituency complains to the ICO, they don't really get the best level of service because they can only really deal with the big structural issues. So there definitely is a gap, and that's the type of kind of structure and process questions that we need to try to understand and implement through the online harms white paper.
Victoria, is it that gap that you think is the barrier to this sort of flourishing digital possibility?
I think it certainly has been a key gap. I mean, again, even if we sort of go back 5 years ago, I think we would have been having a very different conversation. There was still an expectation that self-regulation alone would be enough, and we're definitely beyond that now. So I think that certainly, it might take another 5 years actually though to find the right regulatory regime, the right processes, and the right principles. So I don't think we should expect it to sort of improve dramatically overnight, but it's certainly a start. I actually think it's going to be about much more though than regulation. So I think that's necessary, but not sufficient. I think we also need, quite frankly, to look to things like the structure of the tech industry and the wider ecosystem of industries around it. So obviously within tech, we already talk a great deal about the need to have things like much more diversity in the workforce, so that actually we can have better understanding of how different tech applications will affect different people. We need obviously much more education and training on the sort of the social aspects of technology, whether that be ethics questions or some more empirical questions, again, about the role of tech in life. But actually, I also think we're going to see a much stronger role for other parts of industry to play. So things like the VC sector and the advertising sector, I think, will be key in putting pressure on tech firms, if you like, to sort of up their game in order to reduce risks for these other sectors that are part of it. So I think, yeah, more than regulation.
Okay, this is more than regulation, isn't it? A much broader response.
It's a much broader response. I mean, there's a conversation obviously to be had on a day like today about digital resilience, digital education as part of this. I worry that putting too much onus on individuals to try and understand every kind of harm that they're being exposed to online themselves is too big a step. We do a lot of work on digital education with young people in schools here in the UK, and I'm on our research team at ISD, and I spend my days trying to spot coordinated malicious attempts to use the information system to target people with hate, with extremism, with disinformation. It's extremely hard for me to spot when this is happening, let alone someone who's received a few hours of training in school and has to think about a million other things as they're exploring their life on the internet. So I think there's some thinking we really need to do about that education piece, because it's going to be crucial, but I don't think we've got it right. And I'm not sure how we do it sustainably and successfully that doesn't just put an unrealistic onus on young people and other people to be able to do that a little bit for themselves. So yes, I mean, I think it has to be a multi-stakeholder effort. It has to be beyond regulation. But in order for the pushback from other sectors to be successful, and if we're talking here about grassroots communities, campaigners, people who want to share their own voice on the internet equally with those who have more power, then we need to think about leveling that playing field so that the outrage, sensationalist economy that we've got isn't diminishing their power to do that.
Just before we open up to questions from the audience, I wanted to ask one last question. Given that we are sort of the British bit of the IGF, I feel we are, as Darren has mentioned earlier, seeing these competing visions of what the internet could look like, whether it's from in the Chinese model or whatever Mark Zuckerberg's latest one is going to be, whether it's the fifth estate or whether it's the future is private or whether it's what's the Moscow Russian internet law. Lots and lots of these sort of visions. Is there something? What would a British vision of of the internet look like? Is there anything that's sort of uniquely British that we can bring to this party?
Chaos. I mean, delay. No, I'm joking. Well, first of all, I agree with Mark Zuckerberg that lying is bad.
That was profound.
We can all agree on that. I mean, I think it's probably not uniquely British, but it is about Western liberal democracy and the values that underpin that. Now, some of that's really hard, right? So the whole question around encryption and privacy and who should play what role, we don't actually know the answers to yet. I mean, yesterday I was in it, so I also do work on anti-modern slavery legislation, largely through the Commonwealth, where we try to work with Commonwealth countries to legislate in a harmonised way to tackle organised crime around modern slavery. And yesterday I was in a briefing around cyber trafficking. It's largely around sexual exploitation of children in developing countries, and it was being delivered largely through Facebook Messenger and WhatsApp and these types of things. And that immediately then poses the question, well, is it for the state to decide what access you have to what and what is right and wrong? Is it for a private company that's largely an American company to do that? Probably no to both of those. So what's the answer? Now, the kind of Western liberal democratic foundations are under pressure, even in our own Western liberal democracies. And I think we've really got to continue to make the case for those values in a world that is shifting quite a lot. I'll give an example. I was in a session with colleagues from China talking about the social scoring system, and I asked the question, do Chinese citizens worry about this type of stuff? Clearly the answer wasn't, of course they do. No. The answer was, actually, many citizens, especially poorer citizens in China, are really supportive of the system because for the first time ever in a country of that size, they've been able to get access to welfare, training, or housing support, where previously the state didn't really know who was where and what their situation was. And actually their answer was that when they become more affluent or middle class, they then start to worry about their privacy. But it was interesting how, from their perspective, actually they were just delivering social welfare in a way that was very positive, and of course they ought to be doing as a country that has increasing wealth. Whereas in this country, if we suggested that we put all people below a certain income on a government system that dictated what they can and can't have, and obviously in China there's been the negative uses of these systems too, the outcome would be very, very different in this country. So I do think it's about liberal Western values, but I recognise that that's hard in practice. But Britain should definitely be leading that conversation, not just in Europe, but with the US and our friends through the Commonwealth as well.
Sure. True. Agree?
Yeah, I'd agree. I think, actually, it also makes me think I'd be paid good money to see an episode of The Thick of It based on Malcolm Tucker having to do some content regulation work.
It should be bleeps all the way through.
It would be bleeps all the way through, exactly.
Yeah.
I suppose the other thing that I find potentially quite encouraging about thinking about the UK doing more of its own thinking on these issues is two things. One is obviously, quite frankly, the quality of our civil service and the level of sort of expertise that we find amongst that. So I think that puts us in good stead. Secondly, actually, it's our tradition of sort of strong independent regulators. And then the third actually is more complex. I'm not quite sure how it'll pan out. So on the one hand, I take great succour from the sort of strength of our public sector broadcasting and our experience of therefore sort of regulating media for that. On the other hand, I'm also aware that is, it's not as if we can simply apply that model to the internet. And so I sometimes I worry a little bit that we might be so wedded to that it affects how we choose to regulate the internet. But so yeah, certainly for me, I think it's a very positive picture overall.
Interesting. Okay.
I'm in that position of a third panellist when both the panellists before you have said everything useful there is to say about a question. I think that there's already evidence that the UK is leading well among a group of liberal democracies on this issue. Seeing that the EU Commission is considering framing its own thoughts around regulation as a duty of care is I think, testament to the fact that there is seriously important thinking going on at the UK level, and that needs to continue. I was having an interesting conversation with some US colleagues around the issue of the harassment of female public figures online recently, and doing a comparative piece of research on the scale of that, but also of the kind of political and policy responses to that kind of issue. And it struck me as an interesting one to take as an example, just given that in the UK and in Europe, that harm and that risk has been taken on as an example of a threat to how a democracy works, and therefore something that necessarily needs to be dealt with at a kind of state or international level as a harm to our democracy and to others as well as the individuals who are being harmed by it. Whereas in the US context, despite the same kind of really horrendous levels of attacks that have been levied against female politicians over there over the past year, it is still framed very much as an attack on an individual and not as an attack on a democracy or how that functions or the safety and well-being of a broader community. And I think, those kind of differences are going to continue to be really difficult to kind of tether together on a transatlantic basis if we're to move forward and try and find some kind of common ground in how we're thinking about this across the Atlantic, and that worries me, concerns me. So I do think kind of leaning into European allies and other liberal democratic allies that we can find in this area who are willing to take steps forward on this and to lean in to that kind of progressive change is really important.
Thanks so much. Let's open it up to the floor. Any questions? I'm sure I'll be passing the iPad. Wonderful. Yeah, hands up. Okay, let's start over. Can we start over here with the roving light? In the spirit of keeping it digital, try and keep it to 240 characters and a question.
Very important question, but I don't know how we will discuss this. I recently had a small meeting. It was a security cross-checking networks. So now we are talking about.
Can we get to the question, please?
Yes.
Thanks.
We're talking about the CERT security.
Emergency response team, especially, and there are GCSQ, National Cyber Security, who do have their own CERT. So can't it be their collaboration to create a multi-stakeholder platform with the government to form a single CERT alliance? First question goes like this. And second question is, as the Brexit thing is happening, so what will be the cyber security strategy or data migration to, especially, this question goes to Darren. Thank you.
Darren, would you mind answering that question? Is that?
Sure. I mean, the attempt at European level to harmonise how we deal with cybersecurity threats was an interesting example about this geopolitical and collaborative pressure between member states and their own regulators, because, as I'm sure you know, in the UK, the way that we were allowed to implement the legislation was that we essentially said existing regulators, regulated sectors will take a responsibility for cybersecurity. Actually, Ofwat probably wasn't that equipped to think about cybersecurity in the water industry, to be honest. And in my view, there needed to be a kind of stronger collaboration, along with an investment package, actually, because we're still not in the right place in terms of the quality, I don't think, although anyone in the audience who knows better challenge me on this, but around our cybersecurity capabilities, even on nationally significant infrastructure, let alone on fax machines in the health service, albeit I know they're being banned, which is probably a good thing. And this is an example about how do you work in those environments that aren't already regulated? How do you harmonise and how do you collaborate? And actually, I know the European Commission tried to lead on that, but it ended up getting diluted a bit and allowed deviation within member states, which I think was a failed opportunity to try to find that better way of harmonising how we tackle these issues. On the Brexit question, it depends. If there's a no-deal Brexit, one of the things that I'm very worried about is around the security collaboration, both in terms of criminal activities, organised crime, terrorism, sharing of data through the many systems that we use in enforcement in this country and the systems that we currently have access to on the European level, albeit with various opt-outs. But also in terms of just data sharing generally. And so a no-deal scenario is something that we're very worried about. Should we agree a Brexit deal and end up in an implementation period, then of course this stuff will get negotiated and hopefully agreed in a way that would hook in regulatory alignment into the future so that we can maintain that in a seamless way. But it's entirely up for debate at this stage.
Jeremy sent in a question here, which sort of talks to something that we briefly touched on the panel, and the sort of challenges of dealing with international companies, whether it's a kind of legal challenge or it's a cultural clash. What is the best way to create a healthy UK digital society when so many of our platforms are international and sort of subject to a number of competing interests?
So this gets right to the nub of the problem. I think that if I were going to be critical, for example, about the way that we've approached online regulation in the UK, I mean, there is so much to love about the Online Harms White Paper, but one of the things I suppose I would quite like it to have done is have spoken more explicitly to potential international collaborators, or think more clearly about the way in which these will be interpreted by companies operating at the international level. So for me, for example, if I speak to industry colleagues, they say, well, we've got 178 different jurisdictions that we have to deal with. It makes it more difficult for us to obey the law in these countries, not less. So actually, I think, one of the things that I think is important perhaps is to think a bit more about the most general principles that you think the largest number of countries will sign up to on some of these things, get those set up first, and then think about the explicit detail of how you'll apply that within the UK. That would have been my preferred way of doing this.
Just to add on that, I completely agree, and I don't think it's necessarily completely out of the question of getting to a point where you can do that. We just did some work with the Global Counterterrorism Forum, which includes China, the US, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the EU, trying to get to an agreement on language around how governments should deal with preventing and countering terrorist use of the internet. And we did get to an agreement. And, it was a low bar, but it is a bar. and completely agree that if the kind of desire to make those international collaborations work is there, then it can get you much further towards regional or sub-regional kind of agreements that might be much stronger in terms of enforcement.
Anyone in the audience? At the back, yeah, hi.
Thank you. Thank you all for your contribution so far. And for the many good points that have already been made. Now, sort of thinking ahead, say that we had a new government. Say that it was Labour, for instance, just as an example. And it's not just for you, Darren, and that the question is addressed. Looking at, for instance, the current proposals around how to deal with online harms, would you do things differently to try and actually solve the problem as opposed to just legislating?
There's probably 3 questions in that one question. I won't comment on the prospects of there being a Labour government, but I'll answer the other 2. Just legislating. Now, this is always a really important question in this debate because, different parts of the stakeholder kind of or framework have different roles to play. Primary legislation is pretty blunt. I have to be honest. The whole analogy about if you like sausages, don't go to a sausage making factory. It's the same with laws, right? I mean, the House of Commons is political. The time is controlled. Things move too quickly. We often rely on the House of Lords to tidy things up for us. Primary legislation, in my view, can't get into the detail of explaining, or it shouldn't actually, get into the detail of saying how we should do things at a granular level. It needs to set principles and structures and frameworks in which we can operate, and then think about enforcement through public services and their delivery too. So more than just legislate, I think the answer is you need to delegate some of the responsibility, whether it's to existing or new regulators, but also to industry and others, to help get this right, because you're not just going to get it fixed by a piece of primary legislation. It's just going to be a nightmare. So I would challenge that slight question on more than just legislate, but it is our function. We do legislate. That's kind of what we're there for. So you've got to get the balance right. What's the Labour position in comparison to the Conservative Party position? It's not that far apart, actually, on online harms. It was actually Labour, not to be part of the political, but it was Labour that suggested a new regulator. I actually don't know whether that's the right answer personally, but that's not something that's being considered in the online harms white paper. There's no question that building a new regulator with the expertise, the powers, the capacity and the skills to be able to do stuff takes time, and there's some really difficult questions in that around actually, well then what does Ofcom and the ICO do? Is it a merger? Then who is it that does? I don't think there's a clear answer on that. The one bit of deviation, I suppose, is around the competition and taxation role. To be fair to the Conservatives, they've been leading the debate on digital tax within the European Union alongside France when there was a failure at European Commission level to try to understand how to upgrade the tax systems to make sure there was better distribution from some of these global companies making lots of profit, but perhaps not distributing it to countries where they make those profits. Ursula von der Leyen has said that that's a priority which they're working with the OECD on trying to deliver. The Labour position obviously would be probably more stronger in terms of state leadership and intervention around competition powers, the view of monopolies, the strength of regulators and the way in which you tax. My only hesitation around that sometimes is you need to think about effectiveness as well as perhaps ideology. I don't know if you're getting the message, but I'm kind of in the centre-left of the Labour Party, not like over there, and I'm trying not to say it so clearly, but there you are, I've said it. So you've got to think about how these things work, but we would certainly take more of an interventionist role than I think from the government, but really we're not that far apart.
We've had a question come in from the floor around education. We've already talked a little bit about that, and my worry when I hear that is that already the PSHE lesson that is only an hour long and is now containing everything from personal finance to sex education. Everything now has to go into that 1 hour PSHE lesson. Is this really a question of education? And how do we broaden it beyond the sort of schools and the teaching system when they're already under so much pressure and often are poorly placed for this kind of education?
I think there's a huge job to be done about expanding education and thought of that from just young people. There's a lot of research to show that on risks and harms like disinformation, that it's people above the age of 50 that are much more likely to engage with or believe disinformation online, for example. So I think in the first instance, we do have to get out of just thinking about this as schools. And also because, as you say, schools are already under an enormous burden to provide so many services as it stands. I wonder if there's a role for actually using the online influence system and the credibility of certain voices to young people and others to do some of this work and try and incentivize behavioral change or kind of critical thinking and how people are using the internet and those systems, which might be an interesting thing to think of, and how you incentivize that, I don't know. But I also worry about the line that you take with that kind of education. So there's a very thin line between building cynicism and critical thinking about what you're seeing online and how that's happening and how that's being targeted to you, versus discrediting trust in all information or in democracies or the processes around you. And I worry sometimes that without better evidence on the proportion and the nature of a lot of these harms, that we're actually playing into the hands of the bad actors who want to discredit these systems and who want to attack them and want to make us believe that nothing is true and nothing is possible, and that we're actually buying into that discrediting of democratic processes, elections, whatever it might be, and that actually we need to make sure that that narrative and that line we have for our educational process around this is not too cynical and pessimistic, and then we're not playing into the problem as well.
I would just add as well that, to go back to that point I made at the beginning about getting away from digital dualism and thinking there's stuff that you do online and then there's real life. I think that actually it's the same with the education question, that actually it's not just that PSHE hour, it's every bit that we teach everybody from babies through to adults about. So when you first set up your first bank account, that's when you're going to start learning about, sort of online fraud and online security. When you're talking about relationships, whether that's with parents or with school, with your church, again, that's why we need to talk about things like online pornography and sexting. These are part of modern life and they can't be allocated to a single hour in a curriculum. So it does require all these different actors to engage. The other thing, I think you mentioned influence. I also think there's a huge role actually for simple things like television, actually. So, somebody said to me recently that things like EastEnders plots on Coronation Street have been hugely influential in discussing things like sexual abuse, for example. So again, this is real life and it needs to be discussed and educated in every aspect of every chance we have. Yeah.
I just had a small piece on the end of that. It drives me crazy that we're not investing in technological transformation of our public services. There's such a huge opportunity there to deliver better public services more cost efficiently in a way that can really deliver the objectives that we seek to deliver through public service delivery. And education is one of them. We still teach kids in the same way that we've done for hundreds of years. There's someone at the front, either not with a chalkboard anymore, but still a board, people sat in a classroom in rows, following a teaching plan, doing some exams and getting marked. I mean, surely, we should be thinking about how we deliver better personalized education, how you deliver that better on a one-to-one basis within the classroom using technology, how we understand the personal point at which pupils are and what they need to get them to the next level in a way that can really deliver on outcomes. Now, I get that there's ethics and risk around all of that, around data and the use of VR headsets and all that type of stuff, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. And actually, if we start delivering the way in which we deliver education, this becomes embedded in every topic, because you might be learning about history, but you're learning about it over a VR headset with someone somewhere else in the world who's showing you something live, and you, as a consequence, you're then thinking about these things. And until we start to reform the way we deliver public services, we're not going to properly embed these issues in the way that we teach.
Wonderful. We've got time for one question, which I'd like to see has been submitted anonymously. Very, very simple one. Yes or no? Facebook has been used to subvert democracy, facilitate ethnic cleansing, and live stream a massacre. Is it time for Article 58, open brackets 2F of the GDPR? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes? Victoria?
Can we explain what that is?
No, I've got no idea either. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much for coming this afternoon, and we'll hopefully be around for a little bit after the panel for any follow-up conversations. Just join me in giving my panel a round of applause. Thank you so much, everyone.